In order to explain the fundamental criterion of morality, or in order to actually even formulate it, we're going to have to first lay down some understanding of certain basic concepts. In particular, here, the concept of utility, since it's going to be central to explaining Mill's theory and formulating a criterion of morality for him. But let me just explain to you a little bit about the motivation of utilitarianism. The dominant view before utilitarianism, or I should say not the, but a dominant view, was one that was propounded by a philosopher named John Locke that you might have heard of. And John Locke heavily influenced the framers of the Declaration of Independence, in particular Thomas Jefferson. And if we look back at the Declaration of Independence, we see that it says that we hold these truths to be self evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, when Locke formulated the same kind of concept, he formulated in terms of life, liberty, and property. But for various historical reasons, property was probably not going to fit in well given what was going on in the colonies with slavery, etc., and what they required in order to get 13 colonies to sign on to the Declaration of Independence. But notice that one more important thing to focus in on was the claim that these rights were endowed by their Creator. That is, there was a theological basis to the claims, the moral claims being made in the Declaration of Independence. That is, we had certain rights. We were asserting certain moral rights, right? Because they weren't legal rights. We're asserting moral rights based on what God has done. Now, a lot of people would be very concerned about this kind of moral theory, and we could spend time in a course like this, which we're not going to, for the sake of this course, worrying about this kind of theological ethics. However, one thing Bentham and Mill wanted to do is kind of divorce the issue of God from the moral theory completely because it becomes problematic. I mean, I don't have a direct line to God, and most of you probably don't have a direct line to God. So, how do we decide what is a God given right and what isn't a God given right? So, based on that, Bentham and Mill want to explain things, explain their moral theory in other terms, maybe in scientific terms. And when we think about it, that's the beauty of pain, pleasure, and pain. Those are things that are psychological things, but they're things that can be measured by science. Perhaps not in their day because they got this theory started before psychology was invented. But today we can imagine psychologists or brain scientists, doing experiments with people and finding out what kinds of things cause pleasure, what kind of things cause pain, and how much pain and pleasure it cause. So there could be, at least theoretically, a scientific basis for this. But in order to do this, and now we're going to begin explaining why this theory is called utilitarianism, because a central concept of the theory is utility. And utility is going to be a measure of pain and pleasure. But we're going to have to make certain assumptions. And I just want to outline the assumptions here. Or that is, Bentham and Mill have to make certain assumptions. And one is that, pleasure can be measured in a standard unit. We're going to call those hedons, or a hedon is the single unit. And similarly, pain's got to be able to be measured in a standard unit. Very scientific. Dolor. For anybody who knows Spanish, I'm told dolor is a word in Spanish for pain. So now we have hedons and dolors, standard units, measurements of pleasure and pain. Now, what we have to do is say a hedon and a dolor are, and maybe about equal isn't right. Maybe they have to be sort of equal. That is, if we're looking, we might say pain and pleasure offset each other. So 1 unit of pain, of pleasure, hedon, can be offset by 1 unit of pain, dolor. So they're about equal measures. Now, the fourth assumption we're going to make is that we can understand what it means for an episode of pleasure being a consequence of an action. That is, how is an episode of pleasure? The idea is somebody does something, and as a result, it causes people pleasure or pain. At least we're going to assume that that makes sense. Now we get into a little mathematics. So the idea is the way we would calculate in principle. That is, we can't really do this. We don't plug things into people's brains. But utility is going to be all of the hedons that result as a consequence of an action minus all of the dolors. And in fact, this is something that is commonly referred to as the utilitarian calculus. Now, don't get nervous about calculus. It has nothing to do with calculus in mathematics, but it's the calculation of utility. So utility is going to be a measure of the consequences, pleasure consequences minus pain consequences in these standard units. And then the question is, for whom? Remember, a little bit earlier we talked about egoism, which is just for the individual, so it's relative. But according to Mill and Bentham, it's for everybody. That is, the pain and pleasure that it results as a consequence of action for everybody in the universe. You might think it's very democratic. That is, everybody counts equally in making this decision and making this calculation.